So the Dhammapada. So we're starting this series of talks about the Dhammapada, this central text in the Buddhist tradition. So tonight I'm going to talk just about the first two verses of the first chapter, in fact. There's a lot to say about that. We could have a whole series just on the first two verses, in fact, let alone the rest. And they're very central to Buddhism in general, or overall. So I'm just going to say a little bit first about, just put the text in its context, just say a little bit about the text itself and what it means and what it's trying to do. So put it in some context. And then we'll look at the verses. So we'll go through the verses. We'll go through these two verses in a little bit more detail. And I'll try and draw out some of the implications or some of the ideas that are lurking behind, as Jeremy said, these very pithy, succinct verses. So try and draw those out to some extent, and also try and get a bit of my own experience about what these verses are saying. So some of how I think what the text is saying has affected my practice and my overall life. So just to try and include some of that in the talk as well. And then look a little bit at some of the images. There are at least two images in the text that are quite striking. So just to draw out those symbols and the symbolism of the two particular images in the text, just say a little bit about those. So I'm not sure how long I'm going to take. I don't know if there will be any fun bits. I mean, if we've got time, hopefully there might be. If we've got time at the end, we might just have a little bit of time to reflect a bit on some of the implications of the text, what it's saying, and just spend a little bit of time just reflecting on what does it accord with us? How does it affect us? And what do we think about what the Buddha is saying? So the context. So as Jeremy said, it's a very early text, and it's very close to what would be considered to be the language that the Buddha himself spoke. So lots of people say it's the closest you can get to the Buddha's word, as it were. It would have originally been an oral teaching, so the Buddha would have uttered these short, pithy phrases and aphorisms, and later on they would have been written down and codified, gathered together into a book or text form. It's a very, very popular text, not just in Buddhism, but also outside of Buddhism. So a lot of people consider it to be one of the classics of literature in the world, as it were. So non-Buddhists also see it as a very significant, important, they might say it's literature, but we'd see it as something different to that, a very important text. And there are many, many different translations of the text. So just a little bit about the name. So it's called the Dhammapada. So Dharma is a very rich term, as we probably know in Buddhism. There's many, many meanings to it. Two of the most significant that are relevant here is, firstly, Dharma means, with a capital D, it means the truth. It means that's how reality is. So when we talk about the nature of reality, that is the Dharma, that's how things are. But also, perhaps more commonly, with a smaller d, the Dharma refers to the teachings of the Buddha. All those suttas and discourses and practices are the Dharma with a small d. So they're the Buddha's teachings and the practices that we follow when we consider ourselves to be a Buddhist. And pada means footstep or footfall. So you could say it's a bit like path. So when you join the two together, you get the way or the path of truth. That's what the Dhammapada means. It's the way or the path of truth. So if we follow the footsteps, if you follow the verses in the Dharma, we're following the path of truth. So it's very neat, isn't it? So it's saying that it's the path to truth with a big T, but also with a small d, it is the path of truth, the path that we follow. So it's quite a small text, as you can see. Here's a copy of it there. So it has 26 chapters, there are 26 areas to it, and there are 423 verses in this version. So they're very, very pithy. They're very, very direct verses. The Buddha doesn't beat about the bush in these ones. He goes straight to the heart of the matter. He gives us a very direct series of teachings. They're also a bit pokey. There's a sort of sense of urgency, and you can get a sense behind what the Buddha is saying, that you need to get on with it. This is the way, and this is what you need to do. So it's quite challenging, as well as being very pithy and direct, and it's also quite poetic. They're like aphorisms. It's challenging, but also very poetic at the same time. So its intention and its purpose really is to guide us along the path. It is the path written down, and has what the path's like and how to follow the path there. So its purpose is to bring us closer towards the truth. That's what it's intended to do. It's also, because it's pithy and because it's very succinct, it's also very good for reflecting upon. Jeremy was saying he used to read it before meditating. It's very good for things like that. Because it's all encapsulated in quite a few verses and words, you can easily memorize them and keep them in mind. So you can just turn them over. You can just sort of stew in them, as it were. You can just let them affect you over a period of time and just be suffused by them. Just let your mind dwell upon them. And that's very important, because it's okay to know things, isn't it? But when we have insight, we turn that knowing into being. So we have to live these things. They have to become our being, as it were. We have to be them, ultimately. So it's not just about knowing the text, it's about translating that into a way of being, how we live our life. So they're very, very good for that. Just one other thing. This text is translated by Sangharakshita, who's the founder of Triratna movement and Buddhist order. It's worth just reflecting that he really was inspired by this text. It really was important to him, very central to him in many ways. He actually memorized the text completely when he was quite young. What's very interesting about it, he says that he didn't understand Pali when he memorized it. So he wasn't memorizing in a language that he knew. He memorized it without, at that time, understanding the language. Obviously, later on, he did sufficiently understand it to translate it. But it's very interesting that he felt it important to memorize a text he didn't understand necessarily. But it was the word of the Buddha for him. He also said he thought it should be emblazoned upon the heart with golden letters. That's how important he thought it was. It's quite an image, isn't it? A text emblazoned upon your heart in golden letters. It was very, very central to him. And if we see him as our teacher, or if we think he might be our teacher, or he's got something interesting to say, it's a very good way to develop a connection with him by just looking at this text. It's very important to have a good relationship with your teachers. And if we come into connection with a text that was so central to our teacher, you can see him as your teacher. It's a very good way to make a connection. Okay, so enough about the context. So let's jump in, as it were, and look at the first two verses. You might well recognize them because they are very popular. So the first verse is, experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox drawing the cart. And verse 2, therein pairs these verses. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows like a shadow that never departs. So those are the two verses. It's interesting, isn't it? The path starts with the mind. The first two verses in the text are about the mind, and they're pointing to the fact that actually the path starts with the mind. That's where we need to start, with our mind. So the main implication of the verses is that mind is central, mind is primary. In Buddhism, the mind is seen as central and it's seen as primary. It comes first. So more importantly than that, we move into the second part of those two phrases. It's also saying that the mind is crucial to our happiness or our suffering. It's not just that it's central, it's absolutely crucial to our happiness or suffering. So the mind is the key, if you like, to whether we experience peace and freedom, liberation, creativity, energy, joy, or whether we experience agitation, frustration, boredom, anger, lack of energy, stagnation. It's the mind that's key to all of that. That's what the text is saying. And it's saying it quite strongly, isn't it? That's what it's saying. So the implication of that also is that it's not what's outside us, it's not external that's crucial to how we experience things. We don't rely on others. There's no reliance on externals. They're not what's affecting us. They're not what's determining our happiness or our suffering. So it's not God or some other divine being. It's not fate or chance or luck. It's not other people. It's not our partner. It's not our boss. It's not our noisy neighbor. It's not material things. It's not whether we have lots of money in the bank or whether we have a nice house or a nice car or the latest designer shoes or a new iPad or whatever it is. None of those are responsible, or none of those determine ultimately our mind and whether our mind is positive or happy ultimately. Yeah. So the text is saying that our well-being, our physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual well-being is in our hands. It doesn't rest anywhere else apart from our hands, or we should say our minds, actually. But you get that message. So our well-being and our happiness, and also our suffering and our frustration, our dukkha, arises from what we do with our mind. This is why mind is so central. And this is why it's saying led by, preceded by, and produced by mind. So in some ways it sounds quite straightforward and simple, doesn't it? But it actually runs contrary to popular wisdom, isn't it? Normally, in popular wisdom, it's the other way around. It's externals that influence our mind. It's those things outside us that make us happy or unhappy, not internal, not our minds. So it runs completely against the normal way of looking at things. So it's also very challenging. But it's also a significant point on our spiritual path. When we recognize that it's in our hands, in our minds, it's up to us. Our fate, our state of our mind, how our life goes, is in our control. It's us. We need to take responsibility for it. So this is potentially very liberating. That's why it's so significant. When we realize this, we realize that actually this is incredibly liberating, or potentially liberating, because we can change. We can determine our own happiness or our own suffering. All of those things that we experience, we can be in charge of, we can determine, we can bring about. So that is incredibly liberating. We can change. It's the whole path. It's down to us. So it's not going to be our teacher or our partner or God who's going to lead us towards freedom and liberation. It's us. Of course, they can support us, some of those things, maybe not all of them, but it is ultimately down to us. That's what the text is saying, and our mind in particular. So that is liberating, but also challenging, isn't it? So let's just unpack a little bit this bit about leading, preceding, and producing, because it's, on one level, it sounds quite straightforward, but it's also incredibly profound, and also very subtle. In fact, the whole of developed Buddhism, in the thousands of years after this text would have been spoken and written down, a whole very, very complicated, sophisticated, you could say elegant, even beautiful series of philosophical developments, texts, and ideas are developed around the mind. Very, very refined, very, very subtle. They have drawn out this aspect of preceded by, developed by, produced by, led by. But we haven't got time to go into that in that detail today. But if you want to, there's a whole hundreds of thousands of years worth of very refined, sophisticated thinking about the mind in Buddhism. So what's interesting here, something to draw out, is actually the translation. Sankarasha says experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. Most other translations say different things or have different translations of that word. They say things like thoughts or events, or sometimes just phenomena. So they don't say experiences, they say thoughts, events, phenomena are the things that determine or shape our mind. So Sankarasha has been very, very perceptive in translating these experiences. It's a much broader category. Well, we're experiencing all the time, aren't we? And we experience more than thoughts. We have a whole range of experiences, emotions, feelings, bodily sensations. And actually our thoughts are quite a small part of our experience of both ourselves, the world, and other people. So experiences is a much, much better term. It's much broader. And actually it gets closer to what the Buddha would have been saying. So the translation is very significant there. It's one of those areas where it makes a lot of difference on who's actually translating the text. So there's a couple of things that the text isn't saying about the mind. When we say produced by mind, it can sound a bit like that phrase, well, it's all in the mind. Everything's in the mind, isn't it? But it's not actually saying that. It's not saying that there is an external world outside us that impinges upon us and influences us. It's definitely not saying that. Which, if you focused on thoughts, you could go down that pathway. It's definitely not saying that. It's not saying there's no external reality that influences us. That would be what in the West we would call a type of idealism. It's definitely not saying that. There's definitely an external world that does influence us. In essence, what it's trying to say, or what it does say, is that our experience is mediated by our mind. It's our mind that influences, sometimes you say shapes, colors, or flavors. Sometimes they use the term perfumes, which sounds quite good for positive mental states, but I'm not so sure about negative mental states. We really associate those with perfume, a bit more sometimes towards the sewerage end of the smell of spectrum. You get the idea. Mind influences shapes, colours, infuses flavours, if you like, our experience. That's what it's saying. And that all of our experiences are going to be mediated through the mind. You just cannot get around that. So it's not a crude form of idealism. It's actually quite sophisticated, very subtle, and very profound explanation of how the mind works and how our experience is determined and shaped by our mind. So, do we believe this? Does it make sense? Is it our experience? Is the mind central and crucial to our experience? Does it ring true? The Buddha always said you must test out the teachings in your own experience. Don't just take it for granted. Actually, my own experience is that actually it's not that difficult to verify. Actually, you can verify it quite straightforwardly in some ways. We all know broadly that we all have a conceptual framework in which we interpret the world, don't we? We can only make sense of what's around us through this shared conceptual framework, all these ideas, beliefs, and opinions. You know, we can recognize all the things in this room quite easily and very quickly. And that comes from a conceptual framework that we all share. In a different time, in a different place, it might be very different for the people present, all of these things in the room. So already we can see that the mind is producing what we're experiencing. Also, we know it on a moment-to-moment basis. I mean, just think about how you experience the world when you're in a good mood, when you're happy. Seems quite good, doesn't it? Even though it's samsara, you know, it can be quite pleasant, the world, can't it? We're happy, everything's going really well, everything seems really jolly. But then if you just think about the same world when you're in a bad mood, or when you're angry, or when you're grumpy, it does seem very, very differently, doesn't it? It just seems completely different. It's like we're inhabiting another world. But is it another world? Or is it our mind? Maybe the world hasn't changed that much. It's just our mind that's changing. I mean, just a simple example, if you're in a good mood and you're walking on the street and someone bumps into you, you're going to say, oh, that's an accident. If you're English, you'll probably say, I'm sorry. But it doesn't really bother us because we're in a good mood, everything's positive. If you're angry, in a bad mood, and the same thing happens, well, who knows what will follow from there. You might use some colourful language, or we might go into a rage. Who knows? The same event has happened again, but our mind is very different, and we're experiencing the world in a very different way. It's the same with people, isn't it? We've just done the Dhammapada. Some of those people we found to be enemies, other people we found to be good friends. It might well be that someone else in this room found the same person a friend or an enemy. Are they different? Or is it our mind that's experiencing them as different? Even ourselves, we're very different from moment to moment, aren't we? The situations are different from moment to moment. They're always changing, and our mind is always changing. And we're interpreting, understanding, perceiving, and producing the world all the time. So in some sense, it's not that difficult to verify, is it? Maybe the Buddha was right. Maybe the experiences are led by mind, produced by mind. So the implication of this, of course, is, or one of the implications is, what we do with our mind, where we place our mind, is really, really important. If the mind is this influential, is this shaping, it's really, really important what we do with our mind. So what do we give our attention to? It's worth reflecting on this. Where do we place our attention? What do we dwell on? In this moment, what are we dwelling on? What we've been dwelling on today? How have we been occupying our mind today? What about this week? Or last week? Or last year? Or for the whole of our life? Where have we been placing our mind? Because the text is saying that that's really, really important, because it will determine how we experience the world. Again, you can do this from moment to moment. You can verify it moment to moment. You can verify it across the whole of your life. What interests you? Where do you put your mind? And how does that affect you? It's really, really important, the text is saying. Really important. So Buddhism is saying that almost we become what we think. And it's most extreme. Think is a bit too narrow again. We become what we experience. Where we place our mind is what we become, ultimately. And again, all our views and opinions and beliefs, all those places where we place our mind, we become those. In a way, that's what we are. When you look at it very closely, which can be quite sobering, can't it? It's also interesting that if you think about what I said, that Sangharakshita memorized the text. It's interesting where he wanted to place his mind, isn't it? He wanted to place it on the words of the Buddha. So maybe he wanted to become the Buddha. Maybe where he placed his mind, he would become. He certainly saw it's important to do that. So the text is really banging home, isn't it? The mind and what we do with it is so, so important. So this means that it's really important for us to be aware, to be mindful, to practice what is often called mind watching. So observing our mind and where it's going, what it's doing, where it wants to go, where we're placing it. So it's so important that we pay attention to our experience. How is the mind? So just a good question to ask. How is my mind? Where is my mind? Where is it right now? Where is it habitually? Where does our mind like to go? What's our interest? Where will it go if it's left to its own devices, as it were, in inverted commas? What sort of tracks will it follow? What pathways? What habits? Where does it go? What triggers it to go in a particular direction? All of these things are really important to pay attention to. So we need to be aware of our moods and our emotions, our feelings, all those sensations that we experience, ideas, our views, our opinions. And of course, we know there's a huge range of these, huge, vast, expanse of different types of feelings and thoughts and sensations. Vast. In fact, in later Buddhism, there's a series of texts called the Dharma, and they go into great detail about all these different various mental states, for example. There are 51 mental states, according to the Yogacara version of the Abhidharma. And well, it's like a guide. You can, it's like a map of the mind. It gives you a map of how the mind actually operates, how we perceive things, but also all the different types of mental states that we experience. So if you want to explore that further, there's a text by Sangharakshita called Appropriately Know Your Mind, and also by Subhuti called Mind in Harmony, which looks at the same thing but from slightly different viewpoints. So that gives us a guideline to, or a map, if you like, to explore our mind in all these different mental states, because they're not always that straightforward. It's not always obvious where our mind is and what's going on and what these different mental states and sensations are. So the most obvious way that we investigate and explore our mind, or experience our mind even, is probably through meditation. That's probably the most common way in which we do it. Of course, there are other ways. We can do it through study. We can do it through friendship or through ethical practice, or just being aware, just being mindful. The meditation is probably the most direct way in which we can observe the mind or watch the mind, or through mindfulness. And meditation, of course, is working directly with the mind. That's what meditation is. We're working directly on this thing called the mind, or this no thing called the mind. What's really interesting is that it's the mind transforming itself, isn't it? Which is quite a fascinating thing to think about. The mind is capable of transforming itself. So the mind can be aware of the mind, which to me has always been very, very mysterious. And I love that idea. It's just, what an adventure. This thing called the mind can experience itself. It can investigate itself. It's also a really significant aspect of the path, I think. When you realize that the mind is capable of observing the mind, when you notice that we've got reflexive consciousness, that actually we're self-aware, that we can use our mind to work with our mind, it's really, really, really significant. You really get that, and everything opens up in a way, because you can change. We can change. Our mind is capable of transforming itself into something much bigger, much faster, much more profound, much more subtle, much more refined, much more enjoyable, much more energetic, much more creative. This thing called the mind is so mysterious, so subtle, so profound. It's revolutionary awareness. There's that phrase, isn't it? Awareness is revolutionary. Really worth thinking about. So again, can we verify this? Does this match our experience? It's what the Buddha's saying, verifiable here. Does it accord with our own experience? Well, in terms of my own experience, talk about my own practice, my own experience of leading spiritual life. Well, I think again, it's quite, I was going to say straightforward, I wouldn't be correct. It's verifiable, I can notice it. So since I've been practicing, I would say I can see quite broad incremental changes in the nature of my mind and my experience, my awareness. Through the practice of meditation, through ethics, through friendship, through study, through reflection, my mind has become much more refined. I'm not saying it's really refined, I'm just saying compared to what it was when I started, it's more refined. It's more sensitive. It's much, much clearer. My mind is much, much clearer. It's a lot calmer some of the time. It's much more plastic, as neurosciences might say, don't they? This in the mind is plastic. It's much more flexible. The mind feels a lot less rigid. It's very, very, be careful saying very, very, it's plastic sometimes. So my mind has definitely changed, without a doubt. I can say that. So I think it is verifiable that when we are aware, when we are mindful, when we realize the power of the mind and what we're doing with it, the cause of what the Buddha is saying. Also, I notice that it changes moment to moment, or particular moments in time. When I first started to meditate, or maybe a year into meditating, I had a period where I was getting quite concentrated. I felt very relaxed and open and sensitive. And every morning when I walked to work, when I went outside the front door, there was a red car parked outside the house. And as I was practicing and having this period of good meditation, it seemed like the car was getting redder and redder every day. And every time I stepped out and had a good meditation, I thought, wow, the car's redder today. And was the car changing? No, I don't think so. It's just my mind was becoming much more refined, sensitive and aware. I could see the car much more vividly. And it was a very delightful experience to see that. So my mind was changing, definitely. My awareness was becoming more refined. More recently, I was on a retreat center called Adhisthana, and this may be an experience where we all notice how our mind could change in the moment very quickly or over a period of time. When we're meditating a lot in very good conditions, we really notice how the mind can change, and where we place our mind and what we do with it has a really big impact. On this particular retreat, there was a lot of meditation, and we were studying a text about the mind, not this one, another one. And maybe about halfway through, after a meditation in the afternoon, I felt really, again, really open and expansive and positive and happy, joyful. And I stepped outside the shrine room and, wow, it was really, really bright and vivid. Everything was really alive and vibrant, the colours, just the sensations, even the wind on the skin, just really, really bright and vibrant. And of course, I've been there for a week. I've been out there all the time. It wasn't like that all the time. I don't think it had changed a great deal in and of itself. Again, it was my mind that was very, very different. And what I had been doing with my mind, been meditating, reflecting in ideal conditions. So for me, it's quite easy to verify again that what we do with our mind, where we place it, has a really, really profound effect in both directions. These are just examples of some of the more positive ones, of course. Also, I think in terms of emotions, when I first came along, I was probably a bit depressed and a bit grumpy and a bit moody. I sort of had a very coarse awareness. I knew that my experience wasn't positive, but I wouldn't have been able to say what my mental states were or my moods, actually. I was just sort of in it, as it were. I was just miserable, basically. Some of the time, most of the time, actually. It's miserable. I wouldn't have been able to sort of be very specific about that. However, now I can recognize those things much, much more readily. So I can tell when I'm, for example, getting angry or if I'm irritable. It's really, really obvious. Very, very obvious to me. Whereas before, it's all just very vague. And my mind was just quite coarse, actually. So practicing does help us to develop the skill of noticing our mind. It takes time, but we can actually become very skilled in it. And you've probably had this experience yourself. If you're in good conditions and you're meditating well, you can actually notice how your mind is unfolding. You can see mental states arising and passing away. You can really notice when your body is really stiff and sore. It becomes very apparent. Again, it's just verifying that how we have our mind really is important. Okay. The other thing you notice is that how our mind has certain effects and outcomes. It produces certain fruits. So we're moving on to the second part of the verse now. Not only do we notice what states we're in, what sensations we're having, what moods we're having, for example, we also notice what the effects of those are. And let's look at the second part of the text. That the Buddha tells us what happens, doesn't he? I'll read it again just to remind us what that's saying. So experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox drawing the cart. So experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows like a shadow that never departs. So those are the outcomes of our mind, if we act in a particular way or speak in particular ways. So the text is saying our actions, our speech, our communication, if you like, is either positive or either pure or impure, according to the quality of our mind with which we perform those acts, or on which our speech is based. So again, it's reinforcing what has been saying earlier on. Our actions and our speech will either be pure or impure according to the quality of our mind. So it's not just noticing our mind, but it's noticing what the effects of where our mind is and how it is central. So it's just worth saying a few things about pure and impure, because they're funny terms, aren't they? We might have strange associations or interesting associations with pure and impure, particularly impure. So when he's talking about pure here, it doesn't necessarily mean it as dirty or soiled or bad. If we've grown up in a Christian tradition, we might see impure in a very negative way. When the Buddha was talking like this, he was talking a particular historical period in a particular culture in India, and he would have been referring or making at least reference to some of the Hindu approaches to purity and impurity, and particularly the caste system. So certain castes are seen as untouchable, for example, or even invisible. So they're impure, they're so impure that other castes can't even touch them or see them. So it would have been a very, very strong term to use by the Buddha, impure. Of course, he's talking about our mind, he's not talking about the person. He certainly wouldn't have agreed with the Hindu approach there. So it's just worth remembering that when we're talking about impure, we're talking about our mind and our mental states and our sensations, not us, as it were, particularly if you've got a Christian condition. I mean, you could use other terms. Often in Buddhism, the terms wholesome or unwholesome are used, or skillful and unskillful. In some ways, they're a bit more, let's say, friendly. They're less sort of loaded, as it were. So you could say that our actions or speech, whether they're wholesome or unwholesome, that determines our mind. It's interesting, the text doesn't really elaborate, doesn't tell us what pure and impure are, or wholesome and unwholesome are. But the whole of the rest of the tradition does, and actually later in the text it does tell us what these are. Again, it's also worth just pausing for a moment and thinking about purity. I've said a bit about impure. It's best not to dwell on impure, as we know what we dwell on, we become. And maybe we should focus on the pure aspect of what's being said there. So often, when we think of purity, or when I think of purity, I think of things like jewels or metal, gold, silver, platinum, rubies, diamonds. They're all considered to be very pure, aren't they? Or crystal. Crystal is considered to be exceptionally pure. In fact, it's just completely pure. And they're often bright and radiant, aren't they? Jewels and precious metals. They sparkle. They reflect the light, they glisten. But they're faultless as well. They don't have any faults in them. They're unobstructed, so light can pass through them, for example, if they're jewels. Often pure means uncontaminated, doesn't it? It's, when we say something's pure, there's no faults or marks or scratches or dents or faults in it. Often pure things are very essential, aren't they? We talk about essential oils and their pure essence or whatever's been extracted. So pureness has an essential quality, it's very essential. It also means very concentrated, doesn't it? When we say something's pure, it's usually very concentrated. And also very potent. Pure things are really potent because there's nothing in there that shouldn't be there, as it were. They're just pure of whatever that essence of the thing is. So they're incredibly potent. So if you think of these terms in this way, so purity, it sounds quite good, doesn't it? And very attractive. So if we act with a pure mind, it's no wonder that happiness and liberation and freedom from suffering could follow. So traditionally, what would we consider to be impure or impure, or impure, unwholesome, would be greed, hatred, and delusion. Sometimes those are three poisons, so that's what the Buddha is referring to here. So when we've got a mind that's based in craving, reaching out, grasping, when we've got a mind that's full of anger or hatred or frustration or boredom, when our mind is deluded and we're sort of cloudy, we don't know where we're going, we're all confused, well, our speech and actions will then lead to suffering, is what the text is saying very, very clearly, isn't it? It will lead to our unhappiness. So it's really important that we notice those things and we try not to be in those states, because it's really affecting the outcome of our life. Again, you can verify this, can't we? We can verify it in our experience immediately and in the long term. It's not nice to be angry, is it? It's a really uncomfortable state to be in. It's really unpleasant. There's a wonderful analogy of the Buddha gave of, when you're angry, it's like picking up a hot coal. You want to throw it at someone, and of course, if you pick up a hot coal, you're going to really burn yourself. So there's anger is just unpleasant in itself, let alone the consequences of it. Craving is similar. Has anybody ever had buyer's remorse? Have they really, really wanted something? And that thing that's so shiny and attractive, and it's going to make us really happy and fulfill all our dreams. And then we got it home and unboxed it. And a few hours later, it's like, and I take it back and get a refund. Great watching children at Christmas, isn't it? Opening all those presents, and then it's like, 5 minutes later, they're not interested in them at all. We're not so dissimilar sometimes. And that's quite unpleasant, isn't it? They chased after something really, really intently, and then when you get it, it's like, really, really deflated and sticky, horrible, craving feeling. So we can verify this too. If we act from greed, hatred, and delusion, it's really, really uncomfortable. And it leads to suffering and unhappiness. Okay. And if we keep doing this, we're going to keep going around, aren't we? The more we do it, it's going to become habitual. So we're going to keep getting the same, if we keep going around like that. If we keep acting from greed, hatred, and delusion, we'll get greed, hatred, and delusion. So the image of the wheel has come in now. That ox is pulling a wheel that's going round and round and round. And it's the wheel of life. And it's going through a rut, isn't it? When those carts go through, they form a deep rut in the ground. So the more and more we go round, the deeper and deeper these ruts become. And the more and more we experience this greed, hatred, and suffering, illusion. And maybe that's enough of that. We should move on to the more positive bit. So the pure mental states, or the pure experiences, are the absence of greed, hatred, and delusion. Or more positively, love, generosity, and wisdom. So the text is also very clearly saying that if we act kindly, if we're generous, if we act with intelligence, awareness, well, then happiness will follow. So freedom and joy and happiness will follow if we act out of these mental states or these experiences of mind. Have a very different outcome. So the text is expounding the very central teaching of Buddhism, which is conditioned co-production, isn't it? It's saying that actions have consequences, and well, thinking has consequences too, or experiences have consequences. So it's another working out of this central teaching of Buddhism. In a way, all the practices, all the methods, the whole path of Buddhism is about trying to lead us from, or to lead us towards this purification, this purity, if you like. The whole path, all of those different meditation practices, all those different texts, all that study, the intention is to lead us on this path of purification. That's what the text is saying. We can see that clearly in ethics, maybe. It gives us a framework in which to act skillfully, wholesomely, purely, if you like. All of those ethical precepts, they tell us the types of actions and behaviors, speech, that will lead to purity, wholesomeness. And The precepts are actually just how a Buddha would behave. So that's how the Buddha naturally acts. He acts with love, compassion, wisdom all the time. That's his natural way of being. So we're following the path to the truth. The Buddha's already at the truth. And we will get there too if we practice, for example, in this case, using ethics as our guide. So we can also be habitually pure, if you like, habitually skillful. So instead of habitually dwelling on greed, hatred, and delusion, we can start to practice and spend more and more, place our mind more and more on the pure aspect. And then, well, the pure, the skillful, and the wholesome will become our habitual way of being instead of impure. So again, it's just reinforcing over and over how central the mind is and what we do with our mind. Now, crucially, is because it leads, proceeds, and produces our mind and our experience. Okay. I just want to say a few things just about the images of the ox and the shadow. Just draw them out and then I'll conclude. So again, there would have been very central images in India, very important images. They had a really strong symbolic resonance with the people of India. When I first thought about the ox, I sort of had a slightly romantic image, a bit like the hay wain by Constable. Nice sort of idyllic scene with horses pulling a hay cart. There's a dog paddling in the river, isn't there? So you think, that sounds quite idyllic. But in India, the ox is pulling a cart, and well, basically it's not a very pleasant image at all, because the ox is probably pulling a very, very heavy cart, and he'll be doing it well until it can do no more. It's a very, very sad sight in some ways. You have this poor ox just pulling a cart full of heavy things all the time, non-stop. Well, maybe it has some rest, but it's his job. It's its reason for being, is to pull this cart full of heavy, obvious stuff. Well, that's the image of our mind when it's impure. It's sort of very evocative, isn't it? You're stuck in greed, hatred, and delusion. It's really, really heavy. It's really unpleasant. It's quite a sobering scene. And again, the wheel is turning of our ox cart. It's the wheel of life. And this image of us going round and round and round in these deeper ruts. There's a very, very strong image. Much more different to the first one I had, the hay wain. So it's just worth reflecting on the image itself, let alone the words. And of course, then there's a shadow, which goes with the pureness. Again, the shadow is a bit different in the West, isn't it? In India, it's very sunny all the time. It's very bright. So you really wouldn't be able to escape your shadow because the sun is there all the time and your shadow will be with you all the time. Maybe not so much here in England or the UK. Sometimes we do associate the shadow with darkness, don't we? Sort of things hide away in the shadow, and certainly in modern psychotherapy and those areas of counselling, often the shadow is seen as something a bit dark and murky. So it might not have the same resonance to us now as it did to someone in the Buddha's time. So maybe we can just think of it as like a constant companion. So when we act from pure states of mind, we've got this constant companion that's very positive and very bright. We can still use the sunshine and the brightness. And it's sort of also this very pure, very potent, very faultless experience. So again, we can reflect on that. The positivity is with us all the time. And we act from generosity, love and compassion and wisdom with us all the time. We have a constant companion. You know, sometimes you see people who look really, really bright, don't they? They look really, really pure. And people who've been practicing for a long time, for example, you can see they can be really, really alive, can't they? Really, really bright, really, really attractive in that sort of way. It's worth reflecting on that too. Right, so I better conclude. I've spoken longer than I thought I would. So what the text is saying, what he's telling us very, very directly, in a very pithy way, is that our mind is primary, is central. Where we place our mind and what we occupy our mind with is really, really important. We can't underestimate the importance of it. It shapes, it influences, it determines our well-being, our quality of life, whether we're free, liberated, joyful, happy, energetic. or whether we're frustrated, miserable, stuck, sad, angry, etc. The whole of spiritual life can be this journey, a sort of quest and adventure to explore our mind, to develop and become more and more pure in a way, and even more pure, more and more and more, with greater and greater depth, just exponentially expand into purity, continue purifying beyond anything that we can conceive right now, until there are no impurities. And actually, we're just pureness. Our whole mind, body, speech is pure, like the Buddha. And when it's like that, of course, it shines. It shines very, very radiantly. And it will shine infinitely. There are no boundaries to it, no obscurations. It is like a crystal. The crystal, when light hits crystal, it just reflects the light, doesn't it? The crystal isn't actually affected by the light, it just reflects the light. And it remains pure, whatever comes into it. It could be like a crystal. The other thing that's often used an analogy for the mind is the sky, isn't it? So we could become like a vast, expansive, pure sky that's completely empty, radiant, clear, full of sunshine, bright. Just very, very radiant with the sun in it. And when the mind is pure and clear like that, what shines out is love and compassion. That's what radiates. That's what comes from this purity, just love and compassion. So it's interesting to go back to something of actually memorizing the text, isn't it, again? Maybe you wanted to be suffused by the Dharma. Maybe you wanted to become the Dhammapada, as I said, or the Buddha's word, the truth. Because where we place our mind will determine our experience. So if we place it there, we'll have a very different experience if we place it elsewhere. So just to finish, what the text sort of suggests to me most of all is just how mysterious the mind is. Also how powerful it is. It's so wondrous, very mysterious, I mean, really, really powerful and really, really potent. It can transform into something we can't even conceive of, something absolutely pristine and pure, perfect. So those two simple verses, I've drawn them out a bit and just emphasized how important it is to think about where we place our mind. So we'll end there. Great.